Excellent. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for our newest episode of our conversation series here with business and professional women of Greater Moncton. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Amanda Devison and I am the president here of VPW Greater Moncton. And tonight I have a great guest joining me and I'm very excited to chat with her. So Katie Davey of Femme Wonk is with me today. And so I'm going to introduce her, give her bio, and then we'll get going here. So just bear with me for one moment. So Katie Davey of Femme Wonk. Feeling like the conversation around inclusive and diverse decision-making was lacking on the East Coast of Canada, Katie Davey created Femme Wonk, a policy and current affairs podcast that seeks to discuss both innovative and traditional public policy through a gender and inclusion lens. Through Femme Wonk, she also speaks, consults, and hosts a book club. Katie Davey is currently policy lead at the Public Policy Forum and executive producer of Policy Speaking. Katie served as Director of Policy and Stakeholder Relation at the Office of the Official Opposition in New Brunswick, Senior Advisor for Policy and Stakeholder Engagement in the New Brunswick's Premier's Office, and President of the University of New Brunswick Student Union. She was a member of the Youth Working Group on Gender Equality for the Government of Canada and a 2019-2020 Action Canada Fellow. Katie holds a degree in political science from the University of New Brunswick and a Master of Applied Politics from Wilfrid Laurier University. Katie advocates for the integration of economic and social policy, and she was just recently recognized by the Future of Good as part of their 21 Young Leaders Impact List. So everyone, please help me in welcoming Katie Davey. Thank you, Katie, for joining us today. It's awesome to have you here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm thrilled.
So I actually, I'll give you a little bit about how I stumbled upon you, and that's kind of how it happened, is I kind of stumbled upon you. So back when the last provincial election was happening, I just was trying to figure out a way to understand the parties and the platforms from a, gender and inclusivity perspective. And I just felt like the usual trend of people focusing on the things that get the headlines, like taxes or whatever the big thing that gets everyone riled up, was really the focus. And those were the things I wasn't really interested in. And somehow in my internet deep dive, I came across your podcast, so Femme Wonk. So I guess let's start with, can you define for everyone, what is a Femme Wonk?
Yes, no, thank you for that question. So it's kind of a two-parted, obviously it's two words, but a two-parted definition in some ways. So as you described, I started the podcast about 2.5 years ago now, and it really was because similarly to what you just described, I wasn't really seeing the types of conversations that I wanted to be engaged in or that I wanted to be kind of hearing or having in our mainstream media and otherwise. And so I said, okay, well, maybe I'll start something. And that was really, it was as basic as that. And so obviously, you get to name these things. And the kind of Femme Wonk has really two roots. So obviously, femme is woman in French. And so I thought it was kind of a very nice way to be uniquely New Brunswick by having that kind of be the first part. Mm-hmm. And then wonk, I actually looked up the definition of this in the Webster Dictionary because we spoke about this before. And I have to laugh at the definition. Okay, so it says, a person preoccupied with arcane details or procedures in a specialized field broadly. Synonyms, a nerd.
Wow, you got burned by the dictionary?
Yeah. So, but it's really like in the policy world, people will often, refer to policy people as policy wonks. And so that was really the marrying together. So it was, about kind of this gender inclusion piece tied with policy at the same time, and the marrying together of those two words. So that's really where the definition came from of Femme Wonk and why we kind of settled on that. And really, I think it broadly describes everything that we have done since then.
Yeah, for sure. And I found your podcast very helpful at that time. So thank you for that. So I'd go on a walk and find myself like being like, yeah, like just like talking out loud, agreeing with you or the guests or whatever was talked about. So I just thought it was really great. And then when I, like, because when I discovered you were here in New Brunswick, and I just thought that was awesome. So I wanted to, once we started doing this conversation series, you were on my list of people I definitely wanted to reach out to. So again, thank you for that. Also, I forgot to mention, everybody, I have my iPad here next to me. If anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to post them in the comments. If you're watching the replay, post them. We'll make sure we tag Katie so she can come back and answer your questions, but feel free to participate. So kind of if we take a little bit of a step back, at what point did you find yourself becoming interested in politics?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's one I'm often asked, frankly, and I don't have a good answer because, I think sometimes folks who go down kind of a route of policy or politics can point to, their days as writing an essay in grade 3 that they want to be the president of the United States, right? Or,
Yeah.
they have this very clear path. For me, it was actually very different. I actually went to university studying kinesiology at the start, so kind of broadly sports medicine, and that's what I was going to do. I realized though halfway through that degree that really it just wasn't for me. I just didn't really see that as kind of the future I wanted to build for myself. Obviously, I was still very interested and continue to be in health and wellness and fitness overall, but it wasn't what I wanted to kind of make my career. And so I did a complete 180. It's still like when I say it out loud, I'm like, what were you thinking? But I went from kinesiology to political science literally overnight in one semester.
Oh, wow.
So I have hilarious electives, right? I have like biomechanics and like motor control as electives to my political science degree. Just means I'm well-rounded, right?
There you go. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, but that's really, I think when I do and kind of interrogate myself a little bit more to see why or to kind of reflect why that pivot happened, though I've always been very much I've always taken on kind of leadership roles in whatever I've done, whether it was, again, through sports, through community, and otherwise. And that was definitely something that has always appealed to me. And I've always been, I think, really fascinated by the question of, why things happen the way they happen and what the world around us is and how it's kind of been made that way. And so that's really still fundamentally what I kind of preoccupy myself with. And I think folks, they sometimes undervalue the role of policy, especially in this kind of very big machine of, whether it's politics or government or what have you. But yeah, I'm a policy wonk, so I have a lot of fun doing it.
So do you find it frustrating, or does it not bother you, kind of the media play for politics? Because like I said, a lot of times when there's elections, there tend to be key they're kind of like button issues, but they're not real issues. Like it's not really things necessarily. There's a lot of over promising sometimes for votes, or there's trumping up of things that aren't real issues. Like, for example, I always go back to like taxes, right? People like to go and pretend like the parties are very drastically different on taxes. But I mean, I think the prime example is New Brunswick has for a long time changed governments over and over again, like every 4 years. And taxes did not do this. Like no political party has the capacity to drastically increase or decrease taxes if they want to stay politicians, really, but it's just not in their best interest anyway. So do those kind of things where it seems like the parties and the media kind of, because people aren't really digging in, right? They're not unpacking policies and things like that because they're so stuck in the fluff or the smoke and mirrors, as it were. So what are your thoughts on that?
I'm just writing a few quick points so I make sure to answer.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, because a couple of things came to mind when you said that. So the first thing I'll say, I actually saw a stat, I think it was maybe this weekend, that really shocked me, but in some ways didn't, which was, it was kind of a stat from Carleton's journalism school. So, one of the best journalism schools in Canada. And the stat was that only about 6% of journalism students take economics courses. And sorry, take first year economics. And so obviously to take any advanced economics, you've got to take your first year. So that would mean that even fewer than 6% would take advanced economics courses. And I say that because I think, to your point, you just highlighted, obviously, as you say, a debate that typically dominates every political discussion and every political election at the provincial level, the federal level, et cetera. And that's, this question of taxes. However, what does not follow that debate is any actual meaningful analysis, right? It's like you said, fear mongering, like, oh, he's going to raise your taxes.
Exactly.
Or like the debt's going to be so big, you're going to have to cut every service, right? Like those are the parallels. And there's no meaningful conversation in between that, right? And I think, two things are happening, probably more than two, but two key things are happening. I think part of this actually has to do with the fact that local journalism is just being decimated across the country. And that has, a whole bunch of root causes, whether that's, the rise in social media and the way that ads work that way, et cetera. But we saw even during the pandemic that news organizations in Atlantic Canada continued to shutter. And so, first of all, there's a capacity issue. Like, I feel for journalists who have to cover, 10 different topics in a day and get stories out on that. Like, there's no way I could do that and do it justice, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's the first part. The second part is, again, to your point, that like one major challenge we've had in the province is that we've now had like the last government before this current government, which again is it depends on how you decide to define it. The last government to actually kind of win re-election, not in a minority situation or a quasi-minority, was Frank McKenna.
That's a throwback there.
Bernard Lord won re-election, but it was such a tight majority that, kind of to your point, he couldn't make any real aggressive change because he was holding on by the skin of his teeth. And then, now we had the current premier, Blaine Higgs, who, called an election a year after the minority situation. So, can we call that a double? Well,
and during a pandemic as well. So there's a lot of asterisks kind of around
that. Exactly. But what that means is, like, frankly, and I can say this, with experience, again, working in a premier's office, like by the time you get up to speed, like you're pretty much heading into another election. So any sort of like meaningful change, and again, that to your point, that includes like a real meaningful dialogue on whether it's, the kind of economics of the province, whether it's healthcare, right? We see that so much. Like by the time you get really like your head around these complex issues, you're a year in minimum, right? Like it's tough. So anyways, all of the things, you spurred lots of thought. So I'll pause right now and, you feel free to pick up on any one of those directions.
There's like a million things. Same thing. I have my little paper here. So since we've talked a bit about the provincial government, so I guess first, have you noticed whether it's like I don't know, do you find that there's even subtle changes or not so subtle changes since the government went from being minority to being majority? And what are those things that you've kind of caught on to since the change with Higgs going from minority to majority?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question at, any government at any level, because of course, the federal government's also in a minority situation right now. When you're in a minority, you just literally have to work together. You just have to be more collaborative because your government depends on it, right? It's very easy to lose confidence, and that means, you're to the polls. So you just have to be more collaborative. At the same time, many, especially kind of Canada-wide, many of the really transformational policies that we know of today, Medicare included, were forged in minority parliaments. So yes, it's a bit more challenging because you have to work together. At the same time, that means, you get to bring in more perspectives and work together. So it's
and you represent really the entire population because everybody is a mix of all of those things.
Yeah, exactly. It's definitely can be more representative, that's for sure. So I think that just naturally, like, that was going to happen anyways, in a minority or in a majority situation, and we're definitely seeing that, there's no question. I think though, one of the things that has persisted is the kind of COVID cabinet committee with all of the party leaders, which I think is generally positive. There is one challenge though, and again, here's me getting, as the dictionary tells me, a bit nerdy and procedural. Can't argue with the dictionary.
No.
One of the things with the cabinet committee that is challenging is, so again, when we take a step back, we have, as we know, a Westminster system, where we elect members of the Legislative Assembly, and they, win by getting the most votes. The government side, or the government rather, is actually just the cabinet. So the government is not even the Conservatives, right? The government is the cabinet. And what that means is that cabinet, I don't recall the size off the top of my head right now, 16-ish members of the 49 members in the legislature, they are bound by something called cabinet confidentiality. They don't talk about cabinet decisions outside of the cabinet room. They typically will kind of stick to, the talking points and the consensus. We have seen, a stray of that in the Higgs government, which I'm happy to circle back on. But those 16 or so people are bound by this cabinet confidentiality. What that means is literally everyone else, including conservative backbenchers who are not part of cabinet, are technically responsible to holding those 16 members of government, which again is just the cabinet, accountable, right? So that's, the opposition, the third parties, like that's what is kind of the model. That's what a Westminster system is. So, and I say that, why is she going here? I say that because what this cabinet committee does is, again, brings the leaders of all of the parties into this cabinet style conversation, which means that it reduces the ability for them to actually hold the government to account.
Oh, okay.
So I think because they're part of the decisions, right? And in some ways, great political idea to the government, right? Let's bring them along. On the other hand, it's much more challenging to hold the government to account on these difficult pandemic decisions when you've been in the room.
When you've been part of the whole thing. Yeah.
Right. So yay, collaboration. However, you do give some stuff up by kind of collaborating. Yeah, I think, especially in New Brunswick, in some ways, the good news here is that by and large, like, yes, there have been challenges during the pandemic. There's absolutely no question. But when you look at both, the country and the world, they have been, not nearly as dire as many other places. So, the parties haven't, or the opposition members rather, haven't had as, I think, maybe much challenge as they may have in a different jurisdiction having that same model. But anyway, so all to say, collaboration is good a lot of the time, but it does have its drawbacks. And so, yeah, it was great and is great to have a minority government that collaborates. At the same time, the way our system works is we need people to hold the government to account. And in this kind of majority situation, you have that ability a little bit more. However, you don't have as much power to negotiate and to collaborate. So.
Right. So I noticed the other day too, like, I guess, I don't know who asked Higgs the question, but they asked if they would do a similar type committee to address some of the nursing shortages and kind of healthcare issues, and he kind of shot that down. So what's your perspective on that? Like, given that you gave us the context now of trying to hold the government accountable, do you think, given the current state of the healthcare system in New Brunswick, is it a good idea to explore the cabinet again, all party cabinet or committee or whatever, or is it better for it not to be addressed that way? Just kind of your opinion again.
Yeah, so no, it's a great question. I think two things. The first is that, and again, based on my own experience working in a premier's office, what we haven't done historically, and especially in these last couple of decades in New Brunswick, because we've just been switching back and forth, and it's been so political. Governments of every stripe have not done a good job at actually engaging with opposition parties and actually giving them information, frankly, and just and seeking their input as well. So I think more of that needs to happen. Again, in something as delicate in some ways as the healthcare system, I just don't know how, well, it's both delicate and political. So I just don't know how much could actually get done at a cabinet committee, kind of all party cabinet committee level, because I just think like there's just going to be a lot of hair splitting, frankly. And I don't know, again, I just don't think, because the healthcare system is so political, I just don't know that the government would frankly feel comfortable sharing as much information, because I think they would be a little bit worried that they were going to, see that information maybe kind of across the headlines of the TJ the next day. And again, like this government in some ways called an election because of their decisions to close emergency rooms, right? And rural centers. Like they lost a cabinet minister over that decision, right? So, obviously if they brought something like that to an all-party cabinet committee, it obviously was not very popular. It would not be at all surprising, especially if, members were from the different ridings that those decisions were going to be made in. They're not going to want to kind of hold that confidence, right? So
yeah, that makes sense. Kind of in the healthcare kind of vein still. Obviously, we've seen a lot of conversation in New Brunswick and even across the country and across the world about the level of pay that caregivers are receiving, and a huge portion of those caregivers are female. Kind of what are your thoughts on that topic, just overall, if you want to drill in, like wherever you want to go with that?
Yeah, let's open the door. Well, yes. So, and I think Moncton is such a bright spot for amazing advocacy on pay equity across the province, and really great advocacy on these topics. Part one, we undervalue care work, however it looks, right? Childcare, elder care, etc. And that, is because we've just live in a society that thinks that, care work is the responsibility of women and they just shouldn't be paid very much to do it. There needs to be a major shift in that. Absolutely, there's no question. I think, to your point, it's majority women's work. It's still undervalued heavily. There needs to be, some major systems change to get us in line. And I think, a perfect example of the challenge here is childcare. So I actually think I had an op-ed, there's an op-ed with Huddle, I don't know if it published yet, but I kind of wrote about the federal government's childcare plan and what the provincial government should do about it. And I wrote a paper on it that just came out on Tuesday, I guess. What day are we? Tuesday today, last Tuesday, with the Public Policy Forum. And really, the crux of it is amazing that the federal government has committed $30 billion to the provinces over the next 5 years to get, towards a $10 a day childcare model. Great. However, if you go and speak to any childcare provider, any ECE, anybody involved in the system, anywhere in the country, they're going to tell you the issue that they face, the biggest issue that they face is wages, compensation, benefits, and working conditions, right? Literally go and ask anybody anywhere. The federal government's plan is silent on wages and compensation, and that's largely because the federal government doesn't have the jurisdiction to do anything there. The provinces do. But again, it kind of comes to this question, because we already know that right now, most governments in Canada, and the New Brunswick government is the same, heavily subsidize childcare workers' wages, which is great, and they should. So, my question right now is, how does this 30 billion actually translate into money directly in the pockets of childcare providers, right? And what does that look like, especially when the federal plan is pretty silent on that? And it will really be the responsibility of the provinces kind of negotiating that into their agreements. And so, there's a big responsibility, frankly, on that sector, on the childcare sector and advocacy sector in every single province, to start kind of lobbying, frankly, their provincial governments to say that wages need to be a top priority in the childcare bilaterals, like no question, because without them, again, we're just going to continue to see poor working conditions. We're going to see women leaving the sector, and because again, they can't survive off of the wages. And there's no kind of long-term sustainability when most providers aren't offering, again, benefits and compensation packages, right? So if we want to actually build a very large and accessible system, which we saw in the pandemic we need to do, then we have to tackle this question of wages. And again, that will have to be done through these bilateral agreements, and it will have to be done by the provinces insisting to the federal government that money be spent there. So I don't know
if you know anything about the Quebec system, but I was just curious if you did, how are the wages in that system?
Yeah, so they're a bit better, and they also have compensation packages broadly. So the Quebec system is not it isn't all roses and sunshine like people do make it out to be. There's still about 50,000 people on the waiting list for the Quebec subsidized model right now, because it's not like you don't walk into every childcare provider in the province and just automatically get I think it's $8.25 or something right now, dollar a day care. It is a kind of provincial system. It's a kind of provincial not-for-profit system. Provincial meaning province-wide, not administered by the province. Okay. That's an important. So it's a non-for-profit sector, heavily subsidized by the province, that is accessible across the province, but it's not universally accessible and it's not universal. So however, folks that are working in that part, so the CPA, I don't know what it is in English, to be honest. But again, the nonprofit $8 a day care, they actually have pensions and benefits. And, we're sitting here talking like that might be, or like that doesn't sound crazy, but most childcare providers across the country don't. And so their compensation packages, just again, the broadness of them are much better. The counter, though, like I said, it's not universally accessible. And the reason for that, again, goes back to actually just having well-trained, well-qualified workers that are able to provide the care. That is an issue across the country right now. These are pre-pandemic numbers, so it's probably worse since, but there's about 15,000 vacancies right now across the country, right? So you can't actually expand spaces if you don't have, well-trained ECEs and childcare workers to actually fill them. So that's an issue that Quebec continues to face. And then there was a third thing I wanted to mention here. There is a question again of quality. So one thing that has been kind of criticized widely about the Quebec system is that in some ways it's trading off a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit of the affordability for the quality piece.
Okay.
But again, those are issues that are easily solvable. Say easily, systems change. But that's kind of, the top three things from the Quebec experience is, again, it's not like you snap your fingers and every kid across the country is going to have a $10 a day space. And that, again, is not at all the experience in Quebec. And I don't think anyone is saying it is. So there's still a lot of work to be done. And it hinges entirely, again, on a well-trained, well-compensated workforce. Like without it, you just literally can't create more spaces. You just can't. There's no way.
Yeah, because I mean, there's just generally a labor shortage across the board, like regardless of industry. And so obviously the ones that don't have pensions and benefits and good pay, no matter how passionate someone is about that particular field, they're going to struggle to fill it, because even the passionate people are probably, to support their own families, are going to have to potentially look elsewhere.
Yeah. Well,
Which
and
is
New Brunswick is
unfortunate.
also, and New Brunswick is also interesting because the ECE program, the EC college program broadly is also an EA program. And so what you'll see is folks can make the decision to go into childcare, and they can also make the decision to go into the school system and be an EA. You see also similar-ish trade-offs in other provinces because like Nova Scotia is actually a great example. They've started offering pre-primary as well, so down to 4-year-olds, maybe 3-year-olds. Don't quote me on that. And so what happened is actually a bit of an exodus of folks working in the childcare space going into the school system, because again, the school systems just have better compensation packages. So, again, this brings back the question, like, who decided, 5-year-old to 18-year-old was when we would provide, quote, education, and thus the people working in that sector should get paid more than the people, providing education care from, 0 to 5, for example. Or again, care for, seniors and others kind of on the other end. It's arbitrary, and because it's arbitrary, we can change it.
Yeah, but we've seen some of those issues with the long-term care homes where there's people working at 2 and 3 because the companies that own them didn't want to employ them full time because they would have to give them benefits and overtime and all that kind of stuff. And so they keep them at part-time, but in order to make a living, they then have to go and work 2 and 3 jobs. And then of course, when COVID hit, that became an issue because then you had people traveling from 2 and 3 locations. And if they were carrying the virus, it became like a whole thing. So, but to me, the spotlight was the fact that these people had to work 2 and 3 jobs. Like that to me was the crazier part. Everyone's like, how dare they go to different? I'm like, they are trying to just feed their family like everybody else. Like, so like, so to me, I think we have a question here actually. Do you have any thoughts about NPO versus private childcare delivery? Lots of discussion about whether quality is impacted on one sector versus the other.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And that question, I think, as well comes up in the long-term care conversation as well. So I actually, I don't have a concrete answer, frankly. I think there are a couple of questions we need to answer within those assumptions. The first is like one of the main reasons why in long-term care there's such a large private sector across the country is that provinces just don't want to build infrastructure. So, they offload it to a private company to build the physical space. And then those people just also run the long-term care where, maybe we need to divide those two pieces, right? Like infrastructure should be different than providing care. It's kind of like, asking like, why would somebody it's like kind of a weird thing when you think about it that way. And I thought that really crystallized it for me. It's not the same really in childcare. It is a little bit, but it's not to the same extent because people aren't physically living in a facility, right?
Yeah.
So it is a little bit different. I think we need to just plug the holes in the system a little bit before we, start kind of closing out providers. Like I said, there's already a massive shortage across the country in labor force. What we'll have probably seen in a post-pandemic world is a lot of childcare providers that weren't able to actually stay open, or a lot of childcare workers and ECEs that, again, weren't able to maintain their employment through the pandemic because of such a shrinkage of the market. And so they, again, might pivot to other opportunities and go elsewhere. So, point one needs to just be protecting the quality spaces that we have right now and trying our best to expand them. And yeah, I think, you know, I don't think that anyone, frankly, should be profiting off of providing care work or care services rather. And again, I say that in the case of long-term care as well. But like I said, I think there's some major systemic challenges that need to be addressed first. And the federal government did signal in their $30 billion commitment that there's going to be kind of a prioritization of nonprofit care. But what that actually looks like in practice will be, I think it remains to be seen. The other thing I'll just note on this is one challenge in New Brunswick is there isn't actually, or there could be one now, but I don't believe there is. There is no actual kind of association that's supporting and regulating the childcare sector broadly. And so, you know, in many cases, folks and providers are kind of left to their own devices to both be able to figure out how to abide by, you know, the provincial rules to be licensed, but also in some ways from an advocacy perspective as well, right? There's no kind of unified voice to support moving some of these conversations forward.
Yeah, and that for sure is definitely, to me, an issue. There should be a body for sure. I think too, I felt like even that though was a bit highlighted with the Ontario crisis with the long-term care, is like they even had these people operating the homes that were supposed to be, you know, monitored by the province, and clearly especially when they had the military go into that one facility, like it was awful. So yeah, I think
sorry, just to a point of clarification. So it's the child care side where there's no regulator. There is on the
long-term
care.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough. So now, kind of switch gears again. So with the majority government being a conservative government, and historically not always women-friendly policies are held and passed by conservative governments, are there any policies, aside perhaps from what we spoke about already, but is there anything that stands out to you that are policies that are impacting women, that women in New Brunswick should be mindful of or think about or ask questions to their representatives on?
So many. Look, I fundamentally, like, the way that I look at policy fundamentally is like everything has a gendered lens and everything has, you know, a broader intersectional lens, right? And so it's not just gender, but there's also a lens of income. There's a lens of race. There's a lens of even just in New Brunswick of location and geography, right? Of language. So I'm, you know, always of the opinion that literally every policy should be unpacked from all of those angles, not just, you know, the typical women's issue quote, right? Everything is women's issue. Everything is, you know, a people's issue. So that's kind of part one. So that's why when I say so many, like literally everything. However, let me get more specific. So the one area that a couple of areas. So I'm gonna write them down. Here's the first. Number one, healthcare. And when I say healthcare, I don't just mean abortion access, which again, we've all been paying attention to the news. We know that that it is getting harder, not easier for women, and not just women, for all folks who may need an abortion to obtain an abortion. So that's part one. However, there was a great court ruling just today that said the court challenge right now by the Canadian Civil Liberties Association against the government has been they've been allowed to be an intervener, is essentially what the decision was today.
Oh, good. That's
and not
awesome.
Only that, it's great. It means that they can move forward. And not only that, but the province has now been charged with $5,000 of reparation to the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. CCLA, there we go. Needed the acronym. For kind of unduly trying to exclude them. So it's not only a recognition that they should be involved, but also that they're kind of actively being excluded. So that's great news. But this also is this also means, and like this is just a mind-blowing stat that I always love to throw around. Since Frank McKenna, and including Frank McKenna, there has been one premier since, and as we recall, Frank McKenna was premier in the 80s, who has not been in court over abortion access in New Brunswick. So we're 2021 right now. That's, you know, about 40 years, and one premier has not been in court, and that was Brian Gallant. So,
wow.
Point one, right? I know, it's insane. It's totally insane.
And again, the flip-flop of parties for a long time here. So that kind of again shows
exactly. It's not a liberal, not a conservative issue. It's exactly
it's
right. So
it's a New Brunswick issue.
So totally. So liberal premiers have upheld this, like we're in court as well to restrict access to abortion, 100%. However, the conversation around healthcare, like one thing that frustrates me, huge issue, like we need to address abortion access, but we also need to recognize that abortion access is not the only type of healthcare that women need that is slightly different, right? So we also know there's these massive waits for gynecological care, right? We know that. We also know, again, the clinic in Fredericton, Clinic 554, was an LGBTQ center of excellence as well, and was providing lots of care for the LGBTQ community as well. That's just not available elsewhere in the province. But it's even, you know, like it's so much more than that. Like, you know, okay, I'm live on Facebook right now and I'm going to talk about pap tests. So
we're here for it. We're here for it.
But think about it, right? Like this is a procedure that, you know, women generally start, and I say women, I should broaden that to folks with uteri, many folks with, anyways. Like we need to have invasive procedures performed regularly. And when you don't have access to a family doctor, you're literally subjecting folks to different people getting up in your biz every couple of years if you're able to actually get like appointments to that if you don't have a family doctor, right? So like think about that. We're just like, hey, come, like it's, anyways. So and I go back, this is not just me, you know, ranting about women's healthcare. I go back actually to the New Brunswick Women's Council. So they did a very comprehensive survey 4 years ago, I want to say, something like that, and asked women across the province, what are your top issues? Like what issues are impacting you? And they were broader too. They again included trans women as well, which I would be shocked if there was an actual other additional survey that was so inclusive and detailed as this one. So it's not a surprise that one of the top issues was healthcare, access to healthcare. Like, so it's not just, again, it's not just me, it's not just all of us individually in our community saying these things. It's a broad consensus that there needs to be improvements here. So, you know, that's point one, healthcare. And again, it's like access to family doctors should be the minimum, and access, you know, to abortion care should be the minimum, right? It should not be ridiculously difficult to just get basic care. So that's the first one. The second one, no, and I'll probably stop on the second point because I just went very deep into that, but obviously you can tell I have thoughts. The second one is that we also know that women, and not only women, but single mothers make up a majority of the people living in poverty in New Brunswick. So about 50% of folks living in poverty are single mother, or sorry, not 50, it's much higher than that. It's 50% of single mothers in New Brunswick are living in poverty. And so we already know that, you know, income inequality and poverty impact women at a higher rate. So again, when I kind of make those quips about all issues are women's issues, like this is again where we look at this cross section. So that means that every single thing that impacts in some way, you know, poverty, low income, just general programs of support, income inequality, taxes, that means that they impact women at a disproportionate rate.
Yeah.
So when we have a minimum wage conversation, we're talking about an issue that's going to impact more women than men. When we talk about affordable housing, we're having a conversation that's going to impact more women than men. Again, when we talk about the tax system broadly, on the lower side, it's going to have more impact on women than men.
Right.
And so, like, these are just, like, we have to actually say that, and we have to actually think about that and look at the systems with that lens, right? When we talk about, you know, revitalizing social assistance programs, that's going to impact women more than men. And that's just from a pure numbers perspective, the truth. Again, I said, though, we have to add on regions, right? So there are certain areas in, you know, St. John and in Moncton especially, and in northern New Brunswick, where there's an even higher rate of poverty. So let's add those kind of compounding factors on top, which again means that we're going to likely have a higher concentration of probably women, of probably, you know, moms who are experiencing this. So how do we frame the conversation that way? Because that's not how it's framed right now at all, right? It's just not. And so how do we do that in a way that removes some of these barriers, that takes that actual kind of lens and approach when looking at these policies and actually does something about it to address these disparities in a way that is actually going to help more women get out of poverty, right? And help kind of close the gap. And again, we go back to our care conversation. We know that it's something like 96% of those working in the care economy are women, and we know their wages are shit, right? Like we need to connect all these conversations. And again, like I said, I think the advocacy community is doing an excellent job at doing that. But they need to persist into our everyday conversations with, you know, our family and friends, right?
Yeah, for sure. Again, it's, you know, it's frustrating sometimes to have to say those conversations to people, to be like, you know, everyone knows a woman, you know, at least one. At least you have at least one woman you like. So don't you want the world to be, you know, treat her the same as they treat you?
And yeah, like, and women are human beings, right? Like, it's as simple as that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So do you feel that a greater representation of women in politics would help some of that? And what are your thoughts in general of how kind of women in politics in New Brunswick has kind of evolved or not evolved over the years?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think generally two things. One, you know, I feel like I say that at the beginning of every answer. Two things. One, two.
Well, there's probably 1,000, so the fact that you're trying to keep it to two is
yeah,
fine.
I'm just exactly. I'm like, okay, gotta remember. So the first is, again, like, over the last two elections, could even be three, but at least the last two, we've at the provincial level have broken records for the amount of women elected. However, it is still so low, right? Like the last election, or two elections ago now, I guess, there were, when there was 8 women, 4 Conservative, 4 Liberal. So that was 2 elections ago. That makes up 16% of the legislature, and that was record breaking. Then, you know, we got a little bit better the next time, and slightly better this time. However, we're not even at, you know, 30% yet, let alone 50%. So yes, there's a long way to go. I think there's a lot of success that we just saw in the New Brunswick municipal election. Like, for the first time ever, you know, Fredericton elected a woman as mayor. You know, Dawn Arnold was reelected, who was the first woman to be mayor of Moncton. Donna Reardon in St. John is the second, maybe third woman to be elected mayor of St. John. So it's kind of crazy for me, at least, I'm sure others feel the same, to say, like, wow, the 3 major cities in New Brunswick are all now mayored by women. Like, that's great news. But, you know, at a certain point, and I don't know when that point is, frankly, a certain point, we need to stop saying it's enough to elect women, and we need to start saying, you know, we want to elect women who are not going to, reject that women's healthcare needs improvement, that are not going to, reject that childcare needs to be expanded, right? Like at some point, it's not, enough to just say we need more women's representation. We have to take it a step further, because we have plenty of examples where, women have been elected and then, continued to repress, the rights of women, right? So, so it depends on the goal, right? If your goal is strictly to have representation of women, we've got a long way to go. If your goal is to, have more policies that improve the lives of women broadly, and like I said, that one threshold of kind of women should be the bare minimum. Like we haven't, talked about even, again, the kind of the intersection of immigrant women, of women of color, of Indigenous women, right? Like,
right. Yeah.
Until like we've got to hit the bare minimum at least, and just electing more women, it's not entirely clear to me that that's going to do that, right?
Well, yeah, even in general in New Brunswick, of any mix, right, of people of color or Indigenous, male or female, there's not an adequate representation in any party, really.
No.
So it'd be nice to see more of that. Like, I remember reading somewhere, I can't remember who said it, but they said, like, I can't wait for the day where we stop talking about firsts, like the first woman to do this and the first Black person to do that. Like, it should just be normal. Like, it would be amazing to get society to the point where you weren't celebrating firsts for things that shouldn't be a first, especially this far into society. And so I always think of that now when I see, like the first whatever, I'm just like, oh, we're still hitting firsts.
Still hitting first. And we've got a lot to go.
And there's a lot more to go. Yeah.
There's never been a woman premier in New Brunswick, right? Never. So we haven't even hit that.
Well, even yet, prime ministers for Canada, right? Like,
I mean,
it's pretty white and it's pretty male.
Pretty thin. Yeah, exactly.
So,
exactly. So
yeah.
A lot of firsts left.
So a random question I wanted to go back to, and I don't know that you know the answer to this, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on it because it's rattled around my brain a couple of times. So I know you mentioned that Brian Gallant is the only kind of premier who hasn't gone to court over abortion access. So I know he did remove some restrictions. So why do you think he didn't remove the 8420 that kind of caused the whole issue around funding Clinic 554 and just other options that could have been available for private clinics to have abortions? So like, why would he, that it just wasn't not on his radar? Like, I just wonder, like, he did get kind of the feather in his cap for removing some of the restrictions, but then there's this one point now that seems to be a really big issue. And so I wonder why that was neglected at the time.
Yeah, totally. And frankly, I've been asked this question a number of times. It's totally fair. I actually think I might have done a podcast episode on this at some point. I think last May, maybe there was one, something like this. Anyways, so here's, I think of it, it's kind of important to understand the context in some ways. So as, again, we've already talked about, every premier up until 2014 had been in court fighting to restrict abortion access. Broadly, again, fighting against Dr. Henry Morgentaler, who, again, the Clinic 554 was the former namesake of. It used to be the Morgentaler Clinic, and Dr. Morgentaler died in, I believe it was 2013 or 14. And so because he passed, it actually essentially ended the lawsuit in New Brunswick. And so that's kind of the first part of this. And at the same time, the time in history, I'll say, kind of quote, we also had, Justin Trudeau, who was running for leader of or had successfully ran for leader of the Liberal Party, and, had his famous lines, right? Like, we're pro-choice, and if you're not pro-choice, you can't run for us, kind of thing. So that was also happening at the federal level. And that was the position very broadly in the election. So that would have been the 2014 election that Brian Gallant took as well. Also, though, you can still talk to candidates who ran for the Liberals provincially in that election who will tell you that they lost in their riding because of that decision. I think that's
Wow.
BS, frankly. But that means they heard enough opposition, at the doors in their
Right.
communities to that in their riding that they think, frankly, I think anyone who loses, they try to justify it, and that's a very easy way to justify it. In almost all of those ridings, those people were never going to win anyways. They were never going to vote for a Liberal. So I say take it with a grain of salt. But I say that just to paint the picture that, and you may recall as well during that election, in some key ridings, there were postcards delivered that had a horrific picture of essentially a fetus on the card delivered all across these key ridings. So there was a lot of, I guess, advocacy on the anti-choice side going on. So I say all of that because, again, Gallant took office. He did, in one of his very first decisions, remove the 2-doctor rule because, up until 2014, you needed 2 doctors, right? And so remove the 2-doctor rule, removed, there was something, that was the big one, the 2-doctor rule, but there was something else, I can't remember what it was. And those were some of the very first decisions. They also, soon after that, that's when the expansions to the hospitals started taking place. So that's when Moncton, Georges Dumont and Moncton City added abortion access. And what's the third? Oh, Bathurst.
Bathurst, yeah.
So those 3 kind of hospitals started offering, and that was kind of at the time, the decision was to add hospital access because, and it's important to keep this in mind, the only private clinic, and again, like private clinic is a rich way of framing that, but the only clinic at the time that existed was the Morgentaler Clinic. It was closing because, again, it was facing funding issues. It had since been taken on by Clinic 554. But there was only, again, that one point. So access needed to be expanded regardless. And even if the kind of the 8420 for the funding would have been removed, it wouldn't have really expanded access anyways. And still, that's still an argument I hold right now, right? If you remove it, it only means folks in Fredericton have access, right? It's not clear that there's going to be a groundswell of clinics that pop up across the province. Maybe there is, but either way, folks in St. John have very limited access, folks in the north have very limited access. And so there's still more that needs to be done. And I think that was kind of the thinking. And I know for a fact there was continued work looking at what areas what hospitals might be able to expand. But I think it was, frankly, it was kind of decision one, like, let's do what we can right away. Then the second major decision was hospital expansion. The third was becoming the first province to offer the abortion pill, Mifgaineso, free of charge. So we were the first province to do that. And now, since just as of last year, every province in Canada offers that as well. So we kind of led the way on that. But it really, I think it was honestly a ran out of time kind of thing. Like, I really do. But that's, again, just to contextualize some of the dynamics at play on the conversation overall.
And essentially, it's still, like, I don't foresee Higgs repealing that, given the stance of the Conservatives have on abortion.
No. And he has nothing to gain by it, right? You have to remember that all these decisions are political, right? We know broadly that young-ish women, I say young-ish because it's, a broad bucket, don't vote Conservative. And that's, again, like, go and look at any stat in any province in the country, federally, provincially. It's just not their base. So why burn?
And if he did do it now, it'll look like he's giving in to political opponent pressure, and that doesn't get him anywhere either. So okay, that makes sense. So I know we're running up on an hour, so this has been awesome. Thank you again. Do you have any advice for women in New Brunswick if they feel passionate about any specific issues, or if they want to try to move the needle on things, or just to kind of go around the noise in the media and they want to focus on certain issues? Like, what are the best steps for them to take to do that, to get more politically involved, even if they're not going to run for office. A lot of us don't want to run, but we definitely want to support women's issues and policies that are kind of repressing women. We want to get rid of those. So what can we be doing as citizens to kind of make that happen?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think there are a couple of things. I would say first and foremost, of course, is, we all have the responsibility to continue to kind of get informed and be as informed as we can. Be honest, a lot of the kind of information around policies and even politics in New Brunswick is quite opaque and not super easy to access.
Mm-hmm.
But like one thing actually that I've been doing over the last couple of years that I found to be really, quite frankly, impactful is reading autobiographies of typically women, but women that, again, are just share different perspectives than I do. I think I've got, what's a really good one? This one. This one. So this one is called "They Said This Would Be Fun" by Eternity Martis. I guess it's getting a bit of a glare. But I loved this one. So it's so honest, but it's about a Black woman's time at Western University and the racism that she experienced there while being a student, basically. And I actually picked it up because, as you mentioned in my bio, I was the president of the student union at UNB. And so I kind of wanted to, again, interrogate myself and see like what, frankly, missteps and mistakes I might have made during my time there by not having that more kind of broad lens. So that's something I've been finding very impactful, is just to read, again, the autobiographies and just broadly books about perspectives that I just don't have. So I would say that is a great way to just, again, kind of expand and understand a bit more broadly. Mm-hmm. To get involved in politics doesn't mean you have to run. I think getting involved in campaigns, whether municipal, provincial, or federal, is not only, a great way to kind of meet folks, common cause, but you feel good about supporting people that you believe in. So I would say, don't discount kind of engaging politically. And I would just say, again, like, do your research, find candidates or parties that really align with your values and support folks. And the other thing I would say beyond that is, like, there are a lot of great organizations doing work in New Brunswick on a number of these issues. And I know many of them are always, eager to have more folks engage, eager to have people really kind of step up and work with them. So I would say, again, if you want to support your community, like, just kind of poke around, Google around, and you'll be pretty, like, honestly, if, just on Google, kind of search some of the words together, right? Like, Moncton, women's advocacy, like, you're going to find all the amazing, like, Moncton is kind of the epicenter in my mind of kind of advocacy on issues impacting women. So I think there's really a great opportunity to kind of get engaged with community organizations as well.
Yeah, and I think too, another good point, a thing that kind of blew my mind, I had Dawn Arnold on here to talk about closing the power gap in women in politics and things like that. And one of the things she had noted was that when she ran the first time for election, all of her donors were male. And so I thought that was a very powerful moment, because a lot of times women think of it from the perspective of volunteering. And that's great. Don't get me wrong. I think people should do that too. But also, I think if you have the ability, if you have the disposable income available to actually put some money behind some of the candidates, again, that you say your values align, that's really, really powerful. And we're at a point too where a lot of wealth is transferring from boomers to Gen X and millennials. And so they're going to have more money at their disposal. And these are some of the things that perhaps women in general, because we weren't allowed to be involved in politics for so long, and just weren't involved because it wasn't something that wasn't even targeting us, really. That these are some of the things we don't even think about. And so I think that's something else to keep in mind. Or same thing, if it's not about a campaign, you could always provide funds to some of these community organizations, because they're the ones 24/7 doing the work. And so while those of us doing our full-time jobs or caring for our families, things like that take up our time, there are those groups that are out there on, in the weeds doing this work. And so, but they need the support, volunteers, they need dollars, they need all that kind of stuff. They need the shares on social media, they need all those things. So these are some of the things that people can incorporate in their lives. So I think that that's really great. That's really great advice.
Yeah, thanks so much for raising that, because I could not agree more. Like, it's, yeah, vote with your dollars, literally. If, and frankly, for candidates, like, if you donate $20 to a campaign, like, the candidate is going to be so grateful, because every candidate is so grateful for any level of support, right? So like,
Yeah.
small things like that mean a lot. Your point about social media is also so important. It costs us nothing to like and share, but actually, again, amplifies messages. So again, could not agree more. And again, even just broader than that, right? Like, there's no reason why we can't also be supporting women-owned businesses and just,
Yes.
prioritizing that in the same way that we prioritize other things, right? So like,
Yeah.
let's buy local, but let's also try really hard to buy from local women, right? And
Yeah.
even more broadly, like, I've just become obsessed with, and I don't know how to pronounce it. Is it Nix, Nix? The like
Yes.
Canadian underwear brand. Yeah, I've become obsessed with them, and their founder just went through a round of raising money to expand, and she was like, if any investor, she's pregnant, like very pregnant. She's like, if any investor makes any reference to my pregnancy, my ability to, lead the company through this next round, etc., they're disqualified. Don't care who they are.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
and she raised a ton of cash. Like, she did reject
so much money.
but she
I
raised
think
a ton of money
or something. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I loved that story so much. And I literally was like, well, I will be buying from you.
Yeah, and I think too, like, same thing. So people kind of get in habits, and that's great. But like, for every trip to Costco, maybe make a point of trying to find a local Moncton business, especially if it's run by a woman. And there's a lot of them. You can find them on Instagram and Facebook, and you know what I mean. Like, I've even discovered more, especially with the pandemic. So just kind of give yourself that personal challenge. There's nothing wrong with going to Costco. We all do it from time to time. But like, switch up some other stuff. Maybe pay an extra $5 for something else. The impact is going to be huge, and the ripple effects in the community are that much greater. The money stays here. Most of those dollars stay within the community. So it's a powerful way to really make a difference. I think we saw that amplified and spotlighted with the pandemic between local restaurants and everything else. Like, it really, they really depend on the community. So we need to keep that. Once we're actually on the other side of COVID, we need, I think, to try to hang on to a bit of that.
Totally. Couldn't agree more.
Awesome. So I want to be mindful of time, and thank you so much for investing so much time with us. That's awesome. Can you tell the lovely people, if they want to know more about you, where can they find you? What are all the wild and wonderful places they can locate you?
Totally. So I am on predominantly Twitter at Katie A Davey, KATIE DAVEY. But also on LinkedIn as Katie Davey as well. Feel free to connect with me in both places. And feel free to email me if you want to connect. I'm katie@femmewonk.com. But yeah, reach out. Happy to chat. Obviously, I'm sure you can tell I could talk about these topics all day, so don't hesitate.
Yeah, I think we'll have to have you back for sure, because there's just so many things. Like, this is just kind of the first kind of crack at it. And I'm sure as things, again, go back to normal, there'll be certain topics that'll come up again that would definitely love to get your insight on, because I view you as a thought leader in this. Like, there's a lot of things I'm an expert in. This is not one of them. So I appreciate the context and the information in this, because again, how I stumbled upon you is really trying to figure out some of this stuff through, as a woman in New Brunswick, what did these things mean to me, and what did my vote mean, and where should I be putting it? So I appreciate that. I appreciate you and your perspective, and keep doing what you're doing. I think it's awesome.
Oh, thanks so much. Hopefully, yeah, someday soon, maybe we'll be able to do this in person in Moncton.
Yeah, that would be awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Katie.
Thank you.